welcome back to my channel. In my channel update video, I spoke about my desire to do more casual discussion videos and reviews, and so that's what this is. This is going to be a review of The Strangers Chapter 1, as well as a broader look at the state of 2024 horror films. I've seen some discussion online amongst horror fans about the so-called disappointing start to the year for horror films, and I don't really agree necessarily. The horror films that I've seen so far in 2024, while not many, have mostly been pretty good. I enjoyed watching the two nun-centric horror films that came out around the same time, Immaculate and The First Omen. Immaculate was a little bit less impressive, but I still enjoyed it. The First Omen to me was much more technically solid as a film. I found Arkasha Stevenson's directorial abilities to be very impressive, and the film really felt like a strong homage to the old school style of horror film that The Omen was, while also bringing a fresh perspective and some interesting new things. I did think it was a little bit bogged down by some of the demands of it being a franchise film. I think there was some weird stuff, especially towards the end, that I found was kind of disappointing. But for the most part, it was a very, very solid horror film, and I thought Nell Tiger-Free gave a great performance. And like I said earlier, I found Immaculate slightly less impressive. I still liked Michael Mohan's film. I think that it was still very solidly done. I just thought that a lot of the weirder ways that they could have taken the story, they didn't, right? They took the more expected, the more cliched approach. I found that the weirder stuff, the more interesting stuff that they did do, tended to be in dream sequences, which I found very disappointing. And frankly, I just didn't find Sydney Sweeney's performance to be as captivating or as impressive as Nell Tiger-Free's was. I still think it was a solid film, though, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoy, the return of nunsploitation in such a strong way into the American mainstream horror cinema landscape, though neither film really did that well at the box office, so I think this will probably be the death of those for a while. We had The Nun 2 last year as well, so maybe there'll be a little bit of a break. I also saw Abigail, which I thought was pretty solid, which kind of surprised me. I didn't really go into that film with very high expectations. I'm not a huge fan of Radio Silence's Scream films, especially Scream 6. I thought that one was aggressively mediocre, but I actually kind of liked Abigail. I mean, it didn't live up to its potential that it could have reached, I think, but that's maybe mostly just because of an aesthetic quality I don't like out of Radio Silence's films, even though I believe Abigail is a solid film. I believe it's better than Scream 6 was by a large margin. Now, this is all to say that there has been a number of horror films that I have enjoyed so far from 2024, even if the quality isn't at an apex yet that we would like to see out of the genre. I expect the second half of 2024 to provide a number of quality horror films that could potentially reach that apex and bring new classics for numbers of years, right? For the next 20, 30 years, everyone will be talking about these films. I believe films like Maxine have that potential. I believe films like Nosferatu from Robert Eggers, who's returning to the horror genre, who hasn't missed yet. I mean, I love all his films. You have Alien Romulus, right? Okay, I get it. Maybe people didn't necessarily like Ridley Scott's films. I enjoyed both Prometheus and Alien Covenant, but I understand a lot of people didn't. Romulus seems like an answer to those fans that didn't enjoy the Ridley Scott films. It looks like it'll be grounded much more in horror and much more in an isolated kind of setting, which made the first one so successful. You also have Return to Silent Hill coming out this year, which will be very interesting to see how Christoph Gans does all these years later, right? He's talking about wanting to make it more psychologically mature, more like a psychological thriller kind of film, as opposed to his more visually bombastic first film. I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm excited to see Return to Silent Hill. The Conjuring Last Rites will definitely provide a box office boost to the genre. While I'm not necessarily excited for the film, Michael Chavez returning as director is an uninspired choice in my opinion. Though I did enjoy The Nun 2 more than maybe most people, I found The Conjuring 3 to be a disappointment, a steep decline from the quality that James Wan was able to produce with the first two films. Now, of course, the 2024 horror genre has brought very disappointing box office returns, with one of the best performing horror films being The Strangers Chapter 1, which is the purpose of this video review. I'm going to discuss my thoughts on the best performing domestic box office opener of any 2024 horror film up to this point. The film was directed by Renny Harlin, which was a bit of a surprise when we first heard the news there would be a new Strangers trilogy, all helmed by Renny Harlin. Right, so this is already building up to be a pretty disappointing film when you have Rennie Harlin, a man who hasn't made an interesting film, right, let alone a horror film, in 20 years. Right, he used to be a big-name action director back in the 1990s, and he did do Nightmare on Elm Street 4, which I never was as big of a fan on, right? I think that's a film where you're really starting to see the steep decline of the series. You're starting to see the series really move into more of a comedic direction. Freddy's completely declawed. It's not even very interesting or scary anymore. It's just a pop culture sort of little moment as opposed to a true horror film. And that's not maybe necessarily just Rennie Harlin's fault, so I don't necessarily fault him for a film nearly 40 years old, but bringing him in, a man who's kind of washed up, and bringing him back into the Hollywood fold to direct a trilogy of prequels to a film that really was as simplistic as you could possibly make it, right? Brian Bertino's original film has the most simplistic storyline. I really enjoy the film. This isn't necessarily a critique. It's using that to its advantage. It doesn't care about plot development. It doesn't care about telling you what the villain's motivations are. That's the number one thing that made this film so interesting. It wasn't necessarily shot beautifully, right? This film is shot much better because you have Rennie Harlin, you have a much more professional crew behind it, but that doesn't really help it. There's nothing in the film to get scared about. When I was watching in the theater, I was extraordinarily bored. The screenplay by Alan Cohen and Alan Friedland, based on Bertino's original story, doesn't take any chances. We follow basically a beat-for-beat remake from the original film, except now it takes place in an Airbnb with a slightly different couple, though very much the same. The only difference is now they're happily together, as opposed to the little bit more of an interesting angle that happened in the first one, where they were kind of breaking up, and there was the failed marriage proposal, and it was unclear where they were going. It built their character up in a much more interesting way than what we get for this film. This film relies on, oh, you remember what this happened, you remember when this happened, which is so stupid, right? Everything goes exactly how you expect it to. Anytime it seems like the couple that's being terrorized by these killers is going to get the upper hand, you just know they're going to waste it somehow, and they do it in the stupidest way possible, right? I'm not necessarily someone who always complains about stupid characters in horror films, but this has to be the stupidest couple I've ever seen in any horror film, which you might think is like just an insanely reactionary take, but if you've watched this film, you know what I'm talking about. It is just unbearably annoying how stupid these characters are, but you have to realize it's based on the screenplay, right? The screenplay has to follow this because there's a whole trilogy now. We already know what has to happen. One of them has to die, and one of them has to survive to continue this trilogy. And so it's just, already we're in a very, very bad spot. So what the hell's the point of having a scene in which the main boyfriend character has a shotgun up to one of the killers and is threatening them? We already know you're not going to pull the trigger, buddy, and you're being stupid by not doing that. So it's stupid. It's more stupid than tense. There's not a single scene in the whole film that's like, oh God, none of them even come a quarter of the way to matching that very tense scene in the original, in which Liv Tyler is just standing there, and in the back is the man with the mask, right? There's no scene that even comes close in this one. Rennie Harlin doesn't have even like a fifth of the talent anymore that Brian Bertino had. And Brian Bertino didn't even have a lot of talent. That was his like first film ever. So I'm boggled by how stupid this film is, how unnecessary it all feels. They even waste Richard Brake, who I was very excited about, right, in the trailer. They show him for half a second. Well, guess what? That's all you get in the whole movie from Richard Brake, who's probably their best asset. Now, I'm assuming he'll be there in the sequels, but it's it's indicative, right, of how dumb they are. They're just going to just regurgitate the first film, but this time they're going to make it way less interesting, and they're going to have no tense scenes at all, and the characters are going to be 10 times stupider, and there's nothing in this that redeems it one bit at all. I think the opening 20 or so minutes is okay. It's fine, but it it all leads to nothing. The home invasion is one of the least interesting, right? The whole point in the first film where they're just kind of emerging from the shadows and you can kind of see them, you can't, they're playing with their victims. It worked in that film. In this film, it just feels so convenient. Every single scene in which one of the characters is just lurking in the background feels like a cheap sort of jump scare type tactic, as opposed to the original film, which just had this weird free-forming kind of sense of plot logic that wasn't necessarily what you would expect, but it was more realistic. It felt real. This one feels very inorganic, very manufactured to create sort of artificial film moments and thriller or horror film moments. Madeline Petch's solid performance, I thought she did decent, was wasted, right? I mean, because the scenes had no tension at all, right? That's the kind of one of the key factors for a home invasion film, is that you feel tense. There was none of that. So Madeline Petch's performance just felt, it felt wasted, right? Working alongside Froy Gutierrez as Ryan, there wasn't really a lot of great chemistry there. I didn't care for them at all together as a couple, and I found that his performance particularly was very blank, was very non-emotional. You had nothing to it. There was no weight at all, nothing. He was just giving nothing to the film at all. It didn't seem to really truly be in this type of situation. He seemed to be acting more than he was in a truly terrifying situation. And this kind of also adds to that sort of filmic quality I was telling you about, where it feels more like they're trying to set up these film moments rather than a home invasion film, which in my opinion works best when it feels sort of raw and like this is happening for real. You kind of want to match that intensity and that insanity that is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? You want to kind of match that sense of anything can happen at any moment, and you have no idea what's happening next and where anyone's coming from, and it feels more visceral that way. It feels more realistic. It feels like you're in a true horror situation, which always works best, right? And I think that when you're trying too much to set up the shots very beautifully, like Renny Harlin does here, and putting most of your focus, right, in cinematography, rather than in crafting a compelling storyline or a compelling scene, even one scene that can compel you, I think you kind of get lost in the woods, basically, and you get this very uninspired and bland product coming out of it. Now, this being said, the film did have a pretty solid box office return, right? Which leads me to the question, are we going to get the next two films in a theatrical release, especially considering the extreme negative critical reception this film has received, the fan negative critical reception? I'm not really aware of that many people that were big fans of this film. Who's going to want to go and see Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 in theaters? Now, maybe if it was released on Netflix, maybe I would watch, sooner. I'm not necessarily inspired to go and watch these upcoming movies in the theaters. I do have a bit of a morbid curiosity to see just how bad they could get under Renny Harlin, especially since they were all filmed back to back, essentially. But really, I mean, who's really going to go and see these films in the theaters? I think that their best bet, honestly, is to abandon that project and release them onto streaming. So with that all being said, I just wanted to give a final sort of nod to this year as being underwhelming for some horror fans, but I think The Strangers Chapter 1, this one is indicative, right, of lazy filmmaking, of filmmaking from studios, from remakes that are very uninspired. That this is the kind of stuff that horror fans do not like, right? And so I was kind of surprised when I heard that this whole trilogy thing was being planned, and the results have been even more underwhelming than I could have even expected. I'm very much looking forward, though, to a number of 2024 horror films. I don't believe this year is necessarily as bad as people are saying, and I really look forward to a number, both of the mainstream ones that are going to do well at the box office, and the ones that are a bit more art housey. I'm looking forward to both. So that being said, what do you think of 2024 horror films? Let me know in the comments. What's been your favorite one this year? Which one are you most looking forward to? And is there anybody out there that liked this film at all? And please let me know that as well. I'd love to hear. Thank you all for watching, and see you next week.